Well, hi again everybody, welcome to my latest video. This is actually part 3 of my Super AMD build. In part 2 I actually went over all the parts that are in it, including the fact that I had just gotten that same day the graphics card that I wanted. Actually a better one than I originally was planning, a 3080 from EVGA rather than the 3070 I had originally been thinking I could get or hoped to get. So I'm going to start populating this PC. I like to start with the power supply, and the reason I do that, it sort of goes along the theme of getting cable management done as we go, since the cables from the power supply are some of the most challenging ones to deal with. I want to get those in the case first, then I can build everything else up around that. Let me go ahead now and open this guy up and start working on it. But before I do that, there is something that I wanted to check. There was a concern that I have with the new graphics card that I have, that possibly it might be too long. So what I want to do, measure from the PCI cover over to this sort of cable management hood that they have built in here. I want to make sure there's enough room. I have a fear that that might not be. Now for this graphics card, according to what I read online, I need a total of, looks like 286 millimeters from the PCI cover over to this hood. This hood is up quite a bit. This hood is actually up, let's see here, what looks like 3/4 of an inch. So this would definitely interfere with it. This sort of cable management hood that they include with this case. This thing here, nice attractive little panel here where the cables can go and hide behind it or come from behind it. Let me go ahead now and try to measure that and see what it looks like. So if I take it millimeter ruler and I come in here and I look at this, it looks like I only have 273 or 4. So it's a good 10 millimeters short. I guess I could cut into this. That's not the most ideal thing for me to do though, if you know what I mean. Let me take a better look at this. Can this be removed? Hey, you know what? This thing might be movable. It looks like there's a second set of slots right over here. So let me go ahead and see if I can remove this and push it over. So it looks like I can remove this screw here, and there's an extra spot here. So this thing looks like it shifts over. So it may actually shift over, hopefully at least 10 millimeters. It looks probably more like about nearly 20. So let me go ahead and take this screw out and see what happens. I guess it looks like it pushes up. Let me pull the whole thing up here. Oh yeah, it comes up. I didn't see a second screw. I was wondering if there would be. Let me move it over to this next slot and let me put the screw in here. Okay, yeah, it's moved over. It's solid. Get the ruler. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, so now it looks like it's at 293, so it moved over 20 millimeters. So I got more than enough now. There's a bit more of a gap here, but the backside is white as well. Okay, now let's get this thing opened up, this power supply. So we can put it inside here. So it's going to go right into here. It was on, I just turned it off. That's something you always got to double check on these power supplies. We're going to need it down so that the fan, which will be sucking in, will get the fresh air through the filter inside the case. So it's going to have to go in this way. Okay, I have the power supply laid out here with the cables that I've selected. Not everybody's going to agree with all of my cable choices, but it's the way I like doing it, and I'll explain why. Well, obviously, the motherboard 24-pin is a given. However, what I've done is for the PCI cables, I've selected 2 of them, even though theoretically you can use one cable with 2 connectors on it for one card. I'm choosing not to do that in this case with my 3080. I want to have a separate cable for each of the 2 connectors, the 2 8-pin connectors on it. That way I'll get the maximum current through this cable. With just one cable, the resistance is higher, the voltage is slightly lower. You potentially are not getting the same amount of power availability when you need it. I'm putting them both in. I'm doing the same thing with the CPU. There is an 8-pin and a 4-pin connector on the motherboard for the CPU 12-volt supply. Now some people will just put one 8-pin connector on and be done with it, but I want to have the maximum capability, especially with a 5900X CPU on that. I don't want any shortcomings and reduction in the voltage because of the extra resistance. So I'm going to put one using all 8, and these split in 2, so the second one half of it will be used. In terms of the SATA power, I only need one of those. Now it happens to have 4 connectors on it, and then this one here is the RGB. There's one that directly connects to the power supply, which is this one here, is straight through, and then there's this one that converts it a little bit. Now one thing I noticed with this 24-pin one, it has the 2 connectors, they're split on the side that goes into the power supply. Well, the problem with it is they're split in a funny way, the way they shrunk wrap this connector. They have to be crossed over. So this one here, you can't get it wrong because the actual tabs to lock it in are the ones that tell you whether you're going right or not. So we'll have to put this one in here, click it in place, and then put this one over here. Now the 2 PCIs, you got 2 PCIs and we got 2 12-volt powers for the CPU. This is going to go in this way into the case. So I'm going to use these 2 here for the 12-volt cables for the motherboard. And the reason I'm doing that puts it slightly closer to the motherboard. And since those have to go and wrap all the way around up into the most extreme hole in the case, this will make it go a little bit easier. So I'll do those 2 next. Then I'll do the 2 PCIs right below that, because it's the same connectors for both the PCIe and the CPU. Then the SATA power cable, that'll go over here where it says SATA or PATA. So again, I'm going to pick the one that is closest to this end, so we get the maximum length out of it. And then the RGB, there's only one place that can go, and that's over here. Now one thing to note about this power supply, as long as we're looking at it in detail, is it has a button here for the RGB. Whether or not you want to use the RGB, it's a momentary switch. It'll turn it on and off. Now an important thing to do next when you put the power supply in is always use the screws that came with the PSU. And I have the 4 of them here now. They came out of a little bag that actually had PSU written on it. That way we have screws that are the correct length so that you don't reach in and damage some internal components. Again, make sure that the fan is on the bottom so that it sucks the fresh air from the bottom of the case and through that filter. Keep all the cables together and just sort of slip this guy in here. Make sure you find the correct holes in the power supply. Generally only 4 holes in the power supply would fit. A nice magnetic screwdriver. Also be aware that sometimes one of them is not a full screw hole on the case, like this one here. You can't use that when there's no screw hole on the power supply, so we have to use this sort of half screw hole. All the other ones had pretty much full screw holes to them, except for this one. Sometimes there's 2 of those, so just be aware of that. And done. Maybe I'll invest someday in an electric screwdriver that's nice and portable that would make this job a little bit easier. Now I'll push all these cables through the appropriate holes that they should go through. So now I should be able to put the back panel back on, and it should fit nice and comfy, right? For now, I'm going to be back there again for sure. There we go. And then the last case prep step that I have to do, it's unique to this build because I'm not going to be using these fans, is I'm going to take these 2 fans off because they'll just get in the way. And I'll put the ones that I want to put in after all of the other parts are in. That takes care of that. I do not recommend screwing these screws back into the fan. This is plastic. It's only got so many times that you can put them in and take them out before they automatically strip. So leave them without the screws, put the screws in one of your extra plastic bags, and we're done. Okay, let's start working on the parts that make this a computer. I have here the motherboard. Let me open it up. Looks like what's over here is the actual antenna. This does have Wi-Fi, which I won't be using, I don't think. So they give you an antenna that goes with it. Pull the motherboard out. In addition to that, I'll pull out of the box some of the other accessories I need. Things like the manual itself. Gonna need that to get things going, although I also have a copy on my computer screen as well. And what's really important here is what I'm going to need is for the M2 drive, the standoff and the screw that locks it down. And then this here is an insulator that has to go in there as well. That's really all I need right now for building this. Now you should put these things together on an anti-static something, whatever you want to use. I happen to have an anti-static mat here, which I will use for part of this until I actually put the graphics card on it. And that's important to understand because the graphics card is going to have a part that'll stick down from the tab, the I/O connector tab at the far end, and I want to make sure that I can get the elevation. So the other option is to take the box, which in itself is anti-static. It's just basically painted cardboard. So you could actually take this and put the whole thing on top of the box. And sometimes that works out better, even if you have an anti-static mat, because you can actually get to see things a little bit more clearly. So I'll leave it like this for now. Okay, now where to start? Well, first of all, one thing I'm not going to do right now is change the bracket for the cooler. I'm not even sure if I have to change it yet. This is the standard bracket that you would use if you had an AMD cooler, one of the standard ones that they provide now. The CPU in this case has one of the standard AMD ones with it, but I'm not going to be using that. I'm going to be putting on an AIO, as you saw from the parts roundup. I'm going to go with the M2. Now there are two places to put the M2. You have one that's right over here, and you have one that's over here underneath this heatsink. They are not exactly the same. They both support full PCIe M.2, which means full bandwidth. They can also be set up if you want to buy the less expensive SATA version of an M2, which runs considerably slower. This one though, this slot right here under the cooler, is of particular note because it'll actually support PCIe 4.0 as opposed to just a PCIe 3.0, which is what this one supports. Now, I only have a PCIe 3.0 M.2. It's still not good to put it here because it sort of gets a little too close to the cooler. If you happen to have a cooler here, and it's an air cooler, it's blowing out. So the standard best practice is to put it over here on the one that's furthest away, and it has the heatsink, which then adds to its cooling. An M2 drive will actually lose performance when you have it in a machine that has too much heat on the M2. So let's go ahead and install the M2 that I have, which is a 512 gig M2, into this one. That's this one right here. Now this one comes with a little cooler to it, which we won't be using. This little XPG top to it. I'm going to leave that off for now, and we're going to depend entirely upon this heatsink. Let me first take off this heatsink. 2 screws. Oh good, they're captured. That makes it a lot easier. Sometimes they're not. Let's pull it off. Don't forget to take off this little plastic coating here. It's little, almost like a tear. That is important. Otherwise you won't get the contact with the M2 that you need. So always pull that off before we put it back on. We'll just leave it here on the side. Let me take a look at my M2. Well, the M2 that I have is what's called a single-sided M2, and I'll show you that. There's nothing on the underside of it. No chip, only on the top side, which is why they gave a little cushion here. What they refer to as a rubber pad, but it's a rubber pad spacer. So that's going to have to go underneath it in order to support this particular one that doesn't have a chip on the other side. If I had a chip, we would leave this off. And it's going to match up with the little rubber component that's already over here. So what we do is we take the M2. Well, first of all, we got to put these little standoffs. They give 2 of them. Don't lose these. They're hard to get if you don't have them. So what I like to do is I'm going to put the one that I need. Now it should be the longest one. So if I have the socket over here, that means I need the standoff in this one right over here. This is the full size M2. So put this standoff in here. Now you could take a wrench because it should be made snug, but I like to just take my long nose pliers and just give it a little twist. Just snug. What I also like to do is I like to put one over on the other M2. That way I know I won't lose it. So I'm going to put the extra one that I have over here so we know it stays with the motherboard. That's a good habit that I've developed on this. When there's 2 M2s, or even if there's one and I'm not using it, I will still put the standoff on, make it snug, and then I have to put the screw in. And then I put the M2 drive in. So you put it in like at a 30 to 40 degree angle into the socket, and you push into the socket until the lands disappear into the socket. And then we got to get the screw here. Now the screw is the standard is a special one, so it sort of fits perfectly. In this particular case, fits perfectly within the area that's allowed. Now we got to get the screw on here. Okay, you don't make it too tight, you just get it in there firmly. So now we take this, pull off the little piece, plastic cover here from it. We take this and we get it in place. Make sure it's oriented right. Again, you don't tighten this down super tight. You just have to make it snug. That's all there is to it. So now the M2 is fully installed. Let me go ahead and get this screw into the other one so I don't lose it, because you want to put not just the standoff, but I want the screw as well. Again, not super tight, just snug. That way it's there and I know I won't lose it. So now I'm going to put the CPU in. My Ryzen 9 3900X. Let's take it out of its packaging. Right over here. Now I'm going to open up this little latch first. It's over here. You push down on this. There's a little plastic part of the socket that's holding it. Push it over to the side a little bit and this thing should pop right up. And when you do that, it opens up the little connectors for it in the socket. We take the CPU. Be very careful handling this. If you look at it carefully, don't drop it because it's got all those little pins on it. It has to go in only one way. One of the corners has a little triangle on it. You see it on the back side, a little gold triangle right there. Well, on the socket, you have the same triangle. And it's sitting right over here on this corner here, right there. So when we put the CPU in, we lay it very, very carefully into the socket. It should not have to be forced. It should just drop right in place. I like to take it and jiggle it side to side and front to back a little bit and make sure that it's locked in. Now I found out in my last Ryzen build, I should be extra careful here and make sure that the socket catches all the pins. So with a very light touch of this index finger, I will push down just gently on top of the CPU as I pull this little lever down and lock it in place. Now I'm still going to clean this before I put the thermal paste on it for the cooler. That was going to happen anyway, but I just found out the hard way in my previous build, as some of you may recall, I actually had two of the memory sockets not being recognized. I thought I had a bad motherboard, but then when I pulled off the CPU, cleaned it off, put it back in, and this time pushed it down and locked it in place, then it worked just fine. So now I don't have to worry about this anymore. It's in here, it's not coming out anytime soon. On an Intel socket, pressure is significantly pushed down on the CPU as you close the little bracket here. So you wouldn't have to do what I did with the fingertip. Okay, before I move on, I want to point out a couple of nice features about this ASUS X570 Pro motherboard. We've already seen the fact that it has two M2s and both of them can run at full speed. This one can even go PCIe 4.0. Has a little fan on top of the South Bridge, the chipset that controls all of the logic of the motherboard. These brackets here are really for the AMD cooler, the one that comes with the chip. We have a total of 8 SATA connectors, 4 here and then 4 here, vertically mounted. Just be careful though, some of these SATA ports get deactivated depending on how you configure other devices on the board. So you refer to the manual and you'll see some of that in there is what I'm referring to. In particular, if you were to put SATA SSDs here, not the M2 that are not PCIe, but SATA, it would take up the actual, we call the lanes for a particular one of these existing SATA connectors. We also have RGB, both regular RGB and the addressable RGB. It has 2 regular connectors, one here and one here, and it has the addressable one over here. Surprised there's only one of those, but I guess, they were in the transition when this particular board was designed. It has 4 memory sockets. Now we're going to be putting in 4 memory DIMMs, but you see the lighter ones, the ones that's more like a gray rather than black, that's where you'd put if you only had 2 of them as opposed to all 4. I'm going to be putting 4 of them in here. This one also has a 2.5 gigabyte LAN that I mentioned in an earlier video. Okay, now let's get the memory in now. I got the 4 of them over here on the side. There's 2 different groupings of LANs on a memory DIMM. There's one that's shorter than the other, the same thing with the socket. Just make sure that you line them up properly. So we're going to start from this end here. Well, first make sure they're all open. Yeah, like usual, the new modern ones, only one side opens up. Make sure they're all open. Push it down in until you hear a click. Make sure it's inside the track. Double click. That's what I usually like to hear. Two clicks on it. Go to the next one. 2 clicks. Next one. 2 clicks. And then finally, the last one here. Two clicks. So we got all 4 of them. I know it's not color coordinated here. These will probably get upgraded at some point in the future. Get a nice RGB set. But I was trying to cut back somewhere in terms of cost. And these are 3600 megahertz. They have a fairly good delay to them in terms of the CL. I think they're good for now, and I'll reuse them once I've upgraded these. But I didn't want to spend what would have come out to probably another 80% more than what this cost me. And it would only be two DIMMs to do that. Let me see, is that it now? The only thing left at this point is to deal with the socket or the CPUs. Well, that does it for part 3, which is the first half of the hardware build. Part 4 is actually completed, and the filming has completed as well. A little bit of B-roll I have to do with it, but it's the editing that's taking the time on this. So it'll be another couple of days before I get the part 4, which will be the remainder of the hardware build. But look forward to it, okay? Hopefully you got something out of this video, and if you did, if you could do me a favor and at least consider subscribing to my channel, that would really be helpful. Well, until the next video comes out, a couple of days only, take care, stay healthy, stay safe.